Welcome to another episode of Behind the Headlines, where we feature experts and journalists discussing a variety of topics. I'm Terry Lipshetz, a senior producer for Lee Enterprises and your host. In this latest episode, Hayleigh Colombo, reporter for Lee Enterprises' public service journalism team, talks about her story on logo apparel for colleges and the labor that is being used to produce the clothing. Hayleigh, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Terry.
Can you provide just an overall synopsis of what this story is about? Because it felt like there was a lot of pieces in it.
I think it's important for people to know, when they go to the university bookstore on, football Saturday and they're, buying a new t-shirt or whatever to, represent their favorite team. I think we make a lot of those buying decisions and don't necessarily think about what all went into it, what all went into making that shirt that is now, on the rack at my favorite university and, being sold for, $30 or whatever, $25. And what all went into it is like this incredibly, it takes an incredibly complex global labor supply chain to make those clothes, to bring them, to consumers. And the reality is that the people who had the hardest job in making that shirt were compensated late. And often those workers are getting poverty level wages that are, hard for them to subsist on in their home countries, making the U.S. equivalent of $1 or $2 per hour, which is even in countries where it costs less to live or the, expenses are less, it's still not enough for them to, have a good life, to, have the even calories that they need to subsist on. And there's lots of abuses that take place in these apparel factories, whether it, people not having the right to form a union or they're, when they try to form a union, being retaliated against for that, sexual harassment, wage theft. And our universities, which are some of our most well-known, brands and most important, institutions in this country, they themselves are profiting off of this system because they earn, millions of dollars of royalties from the sale of this gear. So we wanted to kind of delve into the conditions that this gear is being made under and delve into what, if anything, universities have done, are doing to ensure that, the people who actually make the garments with their logos on it are being treated fairly.
You had an interesting anecdote early in the story about a factory worker from Honduras. Can you talk a little bit about that example that you used about the working conditions and his wages?
Yeah, absolutely. So I spoke with, his name is Dimas Misael Cardona Bar, and he is a worker in a factory that makes Nike gear. So he had recently worked on a University of Arizona alumni t-shirt that Nike is selling for, or, that the university bookstores or, retailers are selling for $35. He has to make upwards of, works on upwards of 750 to 1,000 of those shirts a day. And he makes the equivalent of $97 a week. So essentially, that shirt, college football fans who are buying that shirt, are paying more for it than he makes in a single day, And I think it's important to understand that that wage is not adequate for him to have, a middle-class lifestyle. He struggles to make ends meet, even though his wife is working. He has 2 young kids. One of his kids is a little bit younger than one of mine. So we were talking about that. So, he said it's not enough money to maintain his home. And meanwhile, brands like Nike are profiting handsomely off of this, the sale of this gear, brands and retailers, the markup on the shirt is about 70%. Meanwhile, workers earn, 1% or less of the final cost of the shirt. in workers like him and advocates in this industry, advocates fighting for fair wages, have pointed out that brands and retailers could, ensure that workers are being paid fairly. They're profiting handsomely off of it.
Did you get any feedback from apparel companies?
They largely didn't want to talk about this issue. Nike didn't respond to multiple requests for comment, even about specific issues that had come up in their factories. The other, brands that we reached out to kind of, sent back statements, I would say, about, oh, we care about fair treatment of workers. And I don't want to say that they don't, but I think that there's not a lot of, they don't feel a lot of impetus, apparently, to change the situation. And there are a lot of people, suffering under this system. Experts that I talked with who study the global apparel industry have noted that in order to pay workers a fair living wage for them, it would really not drastically impact the cost of a t-shirt, even if they pass 100% of the cost onto consumers. Like, it would, add like $1 or something like that. Obviously, you could debate whether, consumers should pay the full cost of doing something like that, or brands and retailers should, eat into their profits a little bit to cover that. But it wouldn't be a drastic investment that they would have to make in order to right the ship.
And there's not really a lot of pressure, it seems, right now to right that ship.
There's been kind of waxing and waning pressure over the last several decades. There was, in the 90s and early 2000s when, after U.S. manufacturing of clothing declined and, more and more clothing started being manufactured overseas in these low-wage countries, there was a big outcry about how apparel was being made. I don't know if people remember, like, Kathie Lee Gifford got into a lot of hot water back in the day for, like, her clothing brand. And there have been, various disasters have happened. Horrible disasters have happened over the years. In 2013, a Bangladesh building collapsed. It's kind of known as the Rana Plaza disaster, and more than 1,000 people died, largely garment workers. And it's the worst, disaster that the industry has ever known. So, when situations like that happen, yes, there's a large outcry. But by and large, obviously, there's really not. Consumers are kind of, going about their day, trying to, consumers are cash strapped as well. They're, I'm in the same way. Like, I'm not trying to pay as much as possible to buy a t-shirt. Like, you try to pay try to get the best thing you can for the least amount of money to fit in your budget, you know? And, I've talked with folks who have said it really shouldn't be on consumers. It should be on the brands and retailers, as well as, the large institutional buyers like universities or like professional sports teams, who put that pressure on the brands and retailers to change their practices.
The Honda Ridgeline, Passport, and Pilot are in a league of their own when it comes to rugged capability. Their relentless power and versatility make these vehicles the ultimate challengers for exhilarating adventures and formidable terrain. But it's not just performance that makes these cars special. It's the unwavering determination that inspires everything we do. That's why we're KBB.com's best value brand of 2023.
Find the perfect Honda for you. See your local Honda dealer today.
Available all-wheel drive on Pilot based on 2023 brand image awards from Kelley Blue Book. Visit KBB.com for more information.
And the fact that this story is about universities is interesting because obviously Division I level universities, are big moneymakers with football programs and basketball programs. And it's, it's not professional sports, but there's a lot of money in it, like professional sports. And you get crowds, of 60,000, 70,000, 80,000 or more going to football games. So it's a huge industry. But at the same time, Many of these large schools are also research universities. They study things like labor practices, and
Yeah,
it's kind of an interesting situation. So what kind of responsibility do universities bear here?
it's so interesting. And one of the reasons why we focused on university gear when there is this problem exists across all apparel. Every time you buy a shirt at, insert retailer of your choice, like the same issues are at play. The difference with the university apparel is that they are, public facing, publicly funded, most of the time. Obviously, there's private universities, but publicly funded by taxpayers, institutions of higher learning where, like you're saying, some of the same institutions that, have apparel that's being produced under unfair conditions, those same institutions have, professors there who are studying this issue, Experts have said that, universities do play a big role in trying to, correct this. And to their credit, to the extent that anyone has tried to improve this, universities have. And so I talked to university officials too, who are like, kind of begrudging the fact that, like, well, yeah, people are asking us to do more, but we're really the only folks who are doing anything.
Right.
What else can we do? What we discovered is the investment of time, the people who are really engaged in this, it's really not uniform across universities. There's a core group of universities who are really engaged in this work and who really seem to care about it and are, trying to, use the leverage that they have. But there's a lot of universities, I would venture to say most, based on our research, who don't appear to be engaged in this and, are large, but, themselves, like, could play a role, could be another voice asking, brand of choice to, ensure that workers are paid fairly.
Do sponsorships complicate the issue? Because you have like Nike and Adidas and all these brands will be the official shoe sponsor of such and such college football team or the basketball team or whatever. Are these relationships complicating the issue as well?
Absolutely, they are, because Nike, all these other companies, depending on the school, they're paying, $1 million, multiple $1 million every year, in the form of these, kind of these deals. And that really, they're important business partners of the university. So it's tricky because it's this symbiotic relationship that, what's worth more to the university, the deal, being in good standing with Nike or appeasing some, students who are, activists regarding sweatshop apparel.
Right. You had the interview with the worker from Honduras. You referenced the building collapse in Bangladesh. I know your story references a case in Bangkok, Thailand also. You have these factories in so many different countries. Is this complicating the situation as well? Because it's not like everybody is working in the same country and they're all making apparel in one place. So how is that complicating the situation?
It's incredibly complicated. Honestly, researching this subject, my mind was truly blown about how complex the global supply chain is. Thousands of factories are involved. Schools have, hundreds of licensees who each have their own, set of factories that they use. So it's really hard to track. Like it is very hard to know. And I spent a lot of time trying to kind of track like a specific shirt and find out which factory that shirt was made in. It is so hard to know. It's almost impossible to know. Like, I was going through these like importing logs, like trying to find these shipments that like would give any sort of clue about, okay, like this factory, had an order that came to the US with Nike, with Adidas or Nike as the customer, and like what was in that order. And it'll just say like men's knit tops or something. And it's like, it's very hard to track. Or you'll, obviously, any shirt that you're buying, it'll say, or piece of, apparel that you're buying, on the physical tag, it will say, made in Honduras, made in Thailand, made in Bangladesh. But it doesn't give any more details than that. And there's, hundreds, if not more, factories in all these countries. So it's just really hard for folks to monitor. It's really hard for universities. I mean, universities are not in the business of monitoring factories in Thailand. Like, they're just not. So it's hard to know. And what makes it even more complicated is that brands themselves don't really own their own factories. That's not really a thing. They're all subcontractors. So it's like, okay, these are the, hundreds of facilities where Nike gear is made. But it's not like these people are employees of Nike or employees of Adidas or Under Armour or whoever. So it makes it really hard to track. And it also makes it really hard for anyone to really truly accept accountability for what happens in these places. Because, the university can say, like, well, this is the brand that we worked with. And the brand can say, well, this is the subcontractor that we use. And sometimes those subcontractors they're subcontracting out to other factories. So in the case of the Rana Plaza disaster, for instance, some brands were surprised that their gear was being made there. Like, there was like tags in the rubble and and just like some horrifying images where you would see, okay, this gear, this, shirt was made there. And like the brands themselves didn't even know, because that was, a subcontractor, was sewing the sleeves or something. And there's just tremendous, like with an industry that fragmented, there's tremendous pressure on the factories themselves to have labor costs as low as possible.
I mean, you don't want to provide excuses for businesses, but in some ways it's also difficult for them. They can claim, like, well, we hired the subcontractor and they say we're operating on the up and up, but if they're not doing it because they're not employees of these manufacturers, then it is tougher for them to monitor too.
Right. Absolutely. It absolutely is. I think that, advocates would say, well, yeah, it is tough, but it's also brands and retailers who have, chosen to organize themselves this way, chosen to use subcontractors that they don't track very well. Right. All of this is a choice, and it's a choice that's being made in search of higher and higher profit.
So what's next? Are you going to continue looking at this story? Are there other angles that you're pursuing?
I hope so. Honestly, it's been so fascinating. It's really been so fascinating. I definitely want to keep reporting on it. I mean, I think that it's fascinating to see, what, if any, solutions people have come up with. So one really fascinating, past solution was that there was a, fair trade university logo factory. It's called Alta Gracia in the Dominican Republic. And, universities, like, for a time being, when Alta Gracia was up and running, they would have, displays in the store, like, okay, all these, these people are, earning fair wages. They were, like, on average 3 times the minimum wage or something like that. They had, union collective bargaining rights. They were working in good conditions. And that factory, unfortunately, closed after COVID. And so what other, like, that was obviously such a creative solution that it was, in a kind of a private sector solution. And it did appear to make a difference, or at least show that this model could work. It successfully worked for many years, but the COVID pandemic was kind of the nail in the coffin there. In the past, there was an effort to have, something called a designated suppliers program where, it would really clamp down on the number of factories that did produce university logo gear so that the universities could have a really strong oversight of those factories and what went on there. And that was the solution that a lot of the really involved universities were really hoping for. But that ran into some U.S. antitrust issues and was never came to fruition. So what's the next, private sector creative solution? Is there ever going to be government intervention to solve this problem? Or is this just a problem that we've accepted as a society as kind of the cost of doing business? I hope not, because, in the reporting, it became very clear to me, people are really suffering for something as simple as us being like, oh yeah, I'll pick up a new t-shirt, like a new alma mater t-shirt. There's really, there's people who are behind that who are not living good lives, and that doesn't have to be true.
Well, on that note, Hayleigh, appreciate you coming on today to talk about this, and certainly gonna think a little bit differently the next time I pick up logo apparel, from either a pro or college team, and it does give me something to think about.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Terry.
We hope you enjoyed this latest episode of Behind the Headlines. You can find us on every podcast platform, and we'd love it if you could take a moment to subscribe and leave a review. Finally, if you appreciate what we're doing with this program, we encourage you to invest in local journalism by supporting the newspaper in your community. I'm Terry Lipshetz, thanking you so much for listening to Behind the Headlines from Lee Enterprises.